What's going on, everybody? Thims here. Today we're going to take a look at Ellen Johnson, the former president of American Atheists, in her 2009 attempt at answering Ray Comfort's 8 questions that supposedly atheists can't answer. Comfort, for those who don't know, is the guy who became famous for his 2007 Banana Hands video.
Behold the atheist's nightmare. Now, if you study a well-made banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 ridges. On the close side, 2 ridges. If you get your hand ready to grip a banana, you'll find on the far side there are 3 grooves, on the close side 2 grooves. The banana and the hand are perfectly made one for the other. You'll find the maker of the banana, Almighty God, has made it with a non-slip surface.
Comfort's questions are shown here. Johnson, as we'll see, gives stock answers to the first 3. The last 3 she fumbles around with. And questions 4, what is the purpose of existence? And 5, why is there order in all of creation? She gets completely wrong. So we're going to amend and correct all of her answers.
All right, so if you don't mind, I'd like to go through some of these questions.
All right, sure.
Since you are somewhat of a prominent atheist.
Okay. No one knows what was in the beginning. You'd have to go beyond the universe to find out what happened, and the universe is everything.
The idea that nobody knows what was in the beginning is a stretch. For example, we can read Steven Weinberg's famous 1977 book, The First 3 Minutes, where he explains that the universe existed about 14 billion years ago as a condensed state that looks something like this, out of which, after an explosion, a high temperature resulted, wherein, for example, on page 6, we can read that particles such as electrons, positrons, and neutrinos, and photons were continually being created out of pure energy. So we can glean the general idea that the universe existed at a certain state that abides with the law of conservation of energy, or the first law of thermodynamics.
Can you go beyond the universe? I mean, that's fascinating to think about that. Will we ever know? I'm hoping in our lifetimes we will know. If it means there is a God, and that's the answer, fine. I just want to know. I want to know the truth. We don't know right now.
This last point is incorrect. We know with 100% certainty that God does not exist, and that we will never in the future come to find that God exists. We know this for 2 reasons. Firstly, 90% of all of the world's religions, specifically Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and its derivatives such as Jainism, Sikhism, etc., all derive from Egyptian mythology.
When I read for the first time, Alan, a story that had always, I used to be a professor of New Testament, a story that had always been problematic for me, the raising of Lazarus, which is in the 4th Gospel, and it's the most dramatic miracle that Jesus is supposed to have carried out. He raised a man from the dead who had been dead 4 days. He was really dead. When I came across that story, in all its full details, in an Egyptian dress and an Egyptian setting, right down to to Martha and Mary, and to the coming forth out of the tomb, in every detail, in 1700, before the Common Era, 17 centuries earlier, I realized I was onto something.
Specifically, the Egyptians took astronomical phenomenon and objects such as the sun, the moon, the earth, the Orion constellation, the star Sirius, the annual flood of the Nile, and turned these into gods and developed their what's called Heliopolis cosmology. These became rescripted into patriarchs and messiahs and prophets. So, for example, we know that Ra, the Egyptian god personification of the sun, became Abraham, and in Hinduism he became Brahma. We know that the star Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, which marks the start of the annual Nile flood on June 25th, became Sarah in Christianity and Islam, and became Saraswati in Hinduism, or the wife of the god Brahma. We know, for example, that the Egyptian god Atum the original sun god of Heliopolis prior to his syncretic combination with Ra in the form of Ra Atum, was re-scripted into the character of Adam in Christianity and Islam, or Adimo, as he's called in Hinduism, such as was pointed out by Kant and Voltaire in the 18th century. We know that the annual flood of the Nile River, which was originally personified as the god Nu or Nun by the Egyptians, was re-scripted into the god or patriarch Noah in Christianity, or Noah's Ark, which is a rescript of Nu's solar bark, or Na, as he's called in the Quran, which was re-scripted into the gods Vishnu and the character Manu in Hinduism. We know that the Orion constellation, which in November and December is a human-like figure of stars in the sky that seemingly arises from the dead to a vertical position over the course of a month, was re-scripted into the god Osiris by the Egyptians, and later by the Jewish scholars into the patriarch Moses, and during the Roman recension into the character of Jesus, such as was touched on by Tom Harper in the video we just saw. The second reason we know that God does not exist and will never exist in the future is that we can now define all of social phenomenon by heat, energy, work, power, and force. And what we've found is that you cannot slip or try to slip in theological concept into these modern chemical and physics concepts, using terms such as living energy, higher powers, vital force, or such as has been attempted in Islamic traditions to call something such as the free energy, which is the driving force of social interactions, reactions, the supposed will of Allah. None of this floats anymore.
But, you know, the answers are not going to come from Ray Comfort's Bible. The answers are going to come from astrophysics and cosmology and the like. So biochemistry and, you know, and science, that's where the answers are going to come from.
Here she's digging around in the right area. To get a more modern view, we can read, for example, Lawrence Krauss's 2012 Universe from Nothing, wherein he builds on the work of Paul Dirac, who in 1927 used Einstein's relativity theory, which he applied to the electron, and from that predicted the antiparticle or anti-electron, which he explained can spring out of a vacuum as a virtual particle. From Krauss's book, page 67, we can read, "Once we allow, however, for the possibility that electron-positron pairs can spontaneously appear from nothing for a bit before annihilating each other, we have a new picture of the hydrogen atom." So here you can get a laymanized view of what was at the beginning, according to Krauss.
The Earth is going to, die. When the sun dies, in what, 3 billion years or something like that, the sun is going to 3 or 15 billion years. I don't remember which number. The sun is going to die, and then our planet will die. It's billions of years from now, but we know how the Earth is going to end.
Well, we're up to question number 2. How will life on Earth end? This, in the context of the other questions, is probably the most redefining question out of all of them, in that it is a loaded question. Now, we've already focused on this question since 2009, in the sense that life is a defunct scientific theory. For example, last year I lectured at the University of District of Columbia at the 7th Annual Biophysical Economics Conference, the video of which I'll put in the drop menu.
Life is coming under attack as a nonsense concept according to physics and chemistry. So Michael Brooks in 2005 published a very famous article in New Scientist, where he said the top 13 things in science that don't make sense are the missing universe phenomenon, the dark matter problem, the Pioneer anomaly, number 2, why satellites are accelerating away from Earth and they don't match up with Newton's laws of gravitation. And number 5 is, are you just a bag of chemicals?
So we won't spend a lot of time on this question, but the issue here is that since you were a young infant, you were told that certain classes of things were alive and certain classes of things were not alive. For example, you were told that ants are alive, but that dry sticks are not alive. And this is a arbitrary division that's been passed on to us since the ancient times. So the new view, starting in 1584, is that if you try to differentiate between certain things as being alive, whereas certain things as being dead, you end up with absurdities, and the mind will not tolerate absurdities. Gene Fernald, in his On the Hidden Causes of Things, for example, is the first person who attacks Aristotle in his division of life from non-life. He says, the stone selenite holds the image of the moon even to her very phases. Moreover, the magnet stone points to the pole star. These are dead things, says Brutius. So we know that magnets and the lodestone are not alive, but the ancient people, for example the Greeks, used to say that the lodestone had a soul, and now we throw out these concepts. We do not think the lodestone has a soul anymore. We still have these deeply ingrained religious beliefs or anthropomorphisms ingrained in our mind. So, to continue, he says, do living things likewise draw influences from the sky? Did Aristotle well and truly say, and leave it for written for all posterity, that heat is the condition of life? This last question here is a rabbit hole that goes down for at least 5 years if you try to work on a problem. You'll end up reading Schrodinger's What is Life book, where he says that life is anything that feeds on negative entropy. And if you try to search for what that means, you'll end up with 3 or 4 layers of absurdities. And Linus Pauling was the first to rip that whole thing to pieces in the 1980s. He said that's just garbage. You cannot say that if you're a trained physical chemist that something feeds on negative entropy like a cat laps up milk. Next we have, chronologically speaking, Dennis Diderot, who in 1796 in his D'Albert's Dream says, nothing at first, speaking about the great chain of being and how a life form or a living point can emerge out of matter. He says, then a living point, another living point attaches to this one, and then another, and from these successive conjoinings a single living unity results. For I am certainly unity. Now that is true. The human is a bound state of 26 atoms in a unity called a powered molecule. It's certain that contact between 2 living molecules, now this is an anthropomorphism. You cannot say that a molecule is alive. For example, on my shirt here, when hydrogen reacts with oxygen to form water, we do not, as a modern person, say, unless we are a New Ager, that water molecules are alive. This is what's called modern knowledge. We know that hydrogen is not alive, oxygen is not alive, and water is not alive. But when we try to explain or differentiate between life and non-life, we end up with, or arrive at, absurdities. To continue, is something different from the contiguity of 2 inert masses, and from this difference, what could it be? A customary action and reaction? He's talking about Newton's laws here. That way, everything comes together to produce a sort of unity which exists only in an animal. My goodness, if this isn't the truth, it is very close to it. So here he's on the cusp of the view that there's something wrong trying to differentiate between life and non-life from the point of view of molecules. After the 18th century, we arrive at Goethe and his 1809 Elective Affinities, where People are defined as chemicals based on Torbern Bergman's dissertation on electric attractions, which is the foundation of modern physical chemistry. For example, if you mix A, Charlotte, with B, Edward, and then you throw in C, the captain, you're going to get reactions where possibly a marriage bond might break, new reactions, relationships will form. And the concept of life just goes out the window after this. The concept of life has increasingly been defined as being defunct. To cite one example of recent, if we look at Francis Crick, the co-discoverer of DNA, in his 1966 of Molecules and Men, page 5, he says, "Let us abandon the word alive." This is a very truthful concept, forward-looking concept, in that, without getting into details, Crick got into vitalism debates with what's called the scientific vitalism views of Michael Planey and others who in the mid-20th century were trying to use very scientifically coded life force views mixed with or described using modern chemistry and physics language that only could be picked apart and called out as bunk by someone who was sharp like Francis Crick, who's about top 500 genius number 188. Now, Johnson, who, to clarify, has educational degrees in environmental studies and political sciences, is attempting to answer Ray Comfort's second question, how will life on Earth end, using this generally accepted scientific model.
When the sun dies in 3 or 15 billion years, I don't remember which number, the sun is going to die and then our planet will die.
The processes that occur on the Earth, for example, the growth of this green thing, will cease. Now, we don't have any problem with that. The problem is Johnson's and Comfort's use of the word life. Now, depending on your theological belief system, you can define all three of these things as being alive: the water, the plant, and the earth. For example, in 2004, Japanese researcher Masaru Emoto published his The Hidden Message in Water, when he showed that if you play classical music to water before freezing it, it will form prettier crystals. And from this he attempted to argue that human consciousness is connected with water and water is alive, which is New Age nonsense. It was featured in the movie What the Bleep Do We Know? Likewise, in the 1970s, James Lovelock attempted to argue in his so-called Gaia hypothesis that the Earth is alive. Now, in the 18th century, we might say that everyone believes plants are alive. It's a no-brainer. But if we look at the work of Francis McNabb, a Scottish lawyer turned philosopher, in his 1818, A Theory of Moral and Physical System of the Universe, attempted to blend Christianity with science in his day to argue that in the great chain of being, mind can emerge from matter through a 7-stage process where spirit comes into matter at about stage 4. And he concluded in his new theological or belief system of the universe that a growing plant is not dead, neither is it alive. So from the point of view of McNabb, plants are not alive. The issue here in the modern sense of the matter is that here we see 4 examples of animate carbon-hydrogen-based things. Retinol is a 3-element molecule that's located in the back of your eye. It's comprised of 20 carbon atoms, 28 hydrogen atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. And when light shines on it, it bends and contracts, which enables you to see. DTA is a synthetic molecule made in a laboratory in the University of California, Riverside by Ludwig Bartels, comprised of 14 carbon atoms, 10 hydrogen atoms, and 2 sulfur atoms, which has the property that when heated, it walks. If we add oxygen in the picture, for example, in the molecule AQ, comprised of 14 carbon atoms, 8 hydrogen atoms, and 2 oxygen atoms, we have a molecule that not only walks but carries things. For example, Here we see AQ carrying 2 bundles of CO2 molecules as long as it's heated and powered on a surface. The picture we get from this is that when we add more elements to the picture, we get more properties. For example, the human is a 26 element molecule shown here, comprised of carbon to the power of 27 down to vanadium to the power of 18 number of elements. And intermediate between humans and hydrogens, we have things such as bacteria, which is comprised of 15 elements. And if we go farther down, we have fish, which is comprised of 22 elements. Now the issue here is that we know for certain that subatomic particles are not alive. We know that hydrogen is not alive. We know that, for example, water is not alive. The question is, at what point do we start attempting to characterize carbon-hydrogen-based atomic geometries that animate as being alive? If we try to draw a line, say, between bacteria and something such as coenzyme A or DNA or RNA, we end up with nonsense.
Nothing. Death is the end. You know, nothing happens after death. And that's why we should make the most of our lives. And every single minute enjoy life. And, you know, of course, it's amazing it's amazing how religious people fight to live like everybody else, even though they're going to see their Maker and be with loved ones again. They cling to life as tenaciously as an atheist.
The answer that Johnson gives, specifically nothing, death is the end, is about 70% correct. As we've touched on in question 2, death does not exist as a repercussion of the fact that life does not exist. What the question is asking in an underlying sense is that what happens to the being of a person after one ceases to exist, which in the nuts and the bolts of the question reduces to the fact that modern beliefs in afterlife derive from Egyptian mythology, which is shown here, where in the original conception of things, when a person died, their soul would go into the judgment hall of the afterlife and be weighed on the scale of Mot against the feather of truth. The god Anubis calculated the measure of one's deeds. If the weight of the soul was found to be too heavy with sin, a monster called Amit would eat or devour the soul, and it would go into a fiery pit, according to Egyptian mythology, which became afterwards in Christianity and Islam hell, or in Hinduism and Buddhism a poor state of reincarnation, such as being reborn as a pig or a bat. The weight of the soul, accordingly, is based on what the Egyptians called the 42 negative confessions, the top 12 of which shown here from a 1500 BC version. For example, I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not slain. I have not stolen grains. I have not lied. I have not committed adultery. I have not lain with men. So, according to the Egyptian social scheme of what's right and wrong, if a person had done too many of these things or acts, their being would not be allowed into the afterlife as judged by Osiris and be rejoined with their relatives. In a modern sense of things, what the person or Ray Comfort is asking when he says what happens after one ceases to exist, he's asking what happens to the actions of a person, right or wrong, when they terminate. For example, if a person kills, negative confession number 4, how does that act or acts reverberate through the universe? This is accounted for by Newton's third law of motion, in that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, so that if one slays men and women, depending on the circumstances, for example, whether in war or whether to rob a cash register, those actions will reverberate after a person ceases to exist in, for example, the generations that follow. So that is what the question is asking in an underlying sense, which can be answered according to modern physics and chemistry.
What is the purpose of existence?
To procreate.
So Johnson, a second-generation atheist, thinks that the purpose of existence is to make copies of oneself. This is what's called cultural folklore, and used often in secular circles, in that from the Darwin genetic point of view, the purpose of existence, so to say, is to pass along one's genes, and only those genes that are fit will survive. If we go to a place such as China, we find that it's the state of the system that determines the function of existence, where with their overpopulation problems, it's been for the past 30 years illegal to make more than one copy of oneself. Likewise, whatever answer you give to this question has to hold up and down the great chain of being. So, for example, if I say that the purpose of existence of the hydrogen atom is to procreate, that is, to make copies of oneself, for example, to react with oxygen to form a similar species H2O, we would say that's a nonsense conclusion. Likewise, it's nonsense to hold to this belief in the social sphere of reactions.
Your purpose, your very being, the only thing you're supposed to do is procreate.
To take a look at another point of view from a group of atheists called existential atheists, we're going to look at Albert Camus, who in his 1942 absurdism philosophy said that man's search for meaning, unity, and clarity in the face of an unintelligible world devoid of God and eternal truths or values, one realizes the absurd, that existence is a Sisyphean one. He says, the struggle on a daily basis to push the same boulder up a hill each day, which eventually rolls back down to its starting point. Note the word point at the end of each day. Itself, however, is enough to fill man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. A lot of atheists hold to this belief system as their sense of purpose, in that it's an absurd world, but the daily struggle is enough to keep one content, and that's where one derives their sense of purpose.
That's what your life is pretty much biologically programmed to do. You're born, you procreate, you die.
To give another example of an atheistic point of view in regards to question 4, we're going to take a look at what's called the Weinberg atheism model, in that at the final 2 pages of his 1977, the first 3 minutes, after arguing for 150 pages that the universe originated from a point, goes on to conclude that human existence is just a more or less farcical outcome of a chain of accidents reaching back to the first 3 minutes, and that the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it also seems pointless. Some 20 years later, in his 1992 Dreams of a Final Theory, in the God chapter, he talks about that statement and how it has dogged him ever since. He comments that a recent study of that comment done by Alan Lightman and Roberta Brower, who published interviews of 27 cosmologists and physicists who had been asked what they thought in interview about Weinberg's pointless universe comment. Margaret Geller, a Harvard astronomer, says, "Why should it have a point? What point? It's just a physical system. What point is there? I've always been puzzled by that statement." Jim Peoples, a Princeton astrophysicist, says, "I'm willing to believe that we are just Flotsam and Jetsam." So here we see there's a general consensus that people are loosely agreed with or ambivalent about this conclusion that the universe is pointless. We're going to explain how there is points in the universe, and that the pointless universe model is a fallacious way of looking at things. Here, for example, we have the Blum model done by Harold Blum in 1934, who in his consideration of evolution from a thermodynamic viewpoint uses the thermodynamics of Willard Gibbs to state that we can find a directive factor in the evolutionary process which persists through successive generations. He says this directing factor is necessarily outside of the theological doctrine. He says it avoids all necessity of invoking theological concepts. That means that applying free energy as the guiding factor of how nature selects which reactants will turn into products is a God-free concept. And he gives what he calls a chemical pennyplanation model of his idea of how thermodynamically we can map evolution into three-dimensional landscapes, and how different chemical species in states of existences or phases will form these plateaus wherein we will have minimum points along crevices like this. He says, the modification of the Earth toward its present state must then have taken place with an increase of entropy, which may be regarded as the directive agent for this change. Applied to evolution, he says, the chemical reactions possible would be limited to those taking place with a decrease in free energy, and thus an increase in entropy. So what this means is that the sum of the entropy changes of all the chemical species taking place in the reactive process results such that the overall reaction shows a decrease in free energy, which can be seen on the big model here from 1987, where we have a social system transforming from initial Gibbs free energy state, going through an activation energy barrier, going down to a final Gibbs free energy state. And note, at the bottom is called a free energy well, and this is a point, a final state point versus an initial state point. So here we have points, points, points. So what we have here is a point fullness model of the universe as compared to Weinberg and Atkins and others like him who like to think that from the atheistic point of view the universe is pointless.
Of course, we are now more intelligent beings and we can give our lives more meaning, and we decide what's important to us and what has meaning for us. But I mean, biologically, that's just the purpose of your life.
Here to elaborate on the point fullness model of the universe as compared to the Atkins pointlessness atheistic model of the universe, we have the Huang model developed by David Huang in 2001, juxtaposed with a quote by Max Planck, where he explains how he arrived at his view of the entropy model of natural selection. Planck states in his scientific autobiography that since the question whether a process is reversible depends solely on the nature of the initial state and of the terminal state, examples of which are shown here, a couple at initial state A and B here, and another initial state A and B here, and terminal state below the free energy equilibrium line, and a different terminal state above the free energy equilibrium line, shown here being a plot of reactants going to products, free energy on the vertical and extent or reaction time on the horizontal. Planck goes on to state of the process, but not on the manner in which the process develops. In the case of a reversible process, the terminal state is in a certain sense more important than the initial state. These final states are more important in the selection process of points in the universe, according to Planck, than the initial state. He states, or says, it is as if, so to speak, nature preferred the terminal state to the initial state. He says, I saw this preference in Clausius' entropy, and I found the meaning of the second law of thermodynamics in the principle that every natural process is the sum of the entropies of all bodies involved as the process increases. So in this example, we have 5 bodies, or 4 bodies depending. Body 1, A, B, C the couple, and possibly a B sub C as a child product or another child product. So here we see that nature selects final or terminal state points depending on the stability of the product. If it's below the equilibrium line, it's preferred by nature over those products that ended up at states above the equilibrium line. We can also compare this or extrapolate on the pointfulness model of the universe as compared again to the Weinberg pointlessness model or the Johnson reproduction model of existence with reference to Bill Gates and the formation of Microsoft. Here we see Paul Allen and Bill Gates in 1970 at Lakeside High School coming up with the idea that they want to form a software company. Again, this has nothing to do with reproduction. To quote John Paul Sartre, a follower of Albert Camus, in his 1945 Existentialism is Humanism, he describes what he calls atheistic existentialism, wherein he says, what we usually understand by will is a conscious decision that most of us take after we have made ourselves what we are. We want or may want to join a party, write a book, or get married. But all of that is only a manifestation of an earlier and more spontaneous choice than what is known as will. So here we have Sartre, a noted existentialist, who follows the Camus Sisyphean purpose model, stating that things we glean a sense of purpose as, or divine a sense of purpose, as Einstein would metaphorically say, are based on spontaneous choices. And the measure of this spontaneity on whether a thing goes over the activation energy barrier is the free energy. And that the farther down the products are below the equilibrium line, the greater the spontaneity. And the free energy is shown on my shirt here by the partial of the Gibbs free energy per extent of reaction at constant pressure and temperature, the negative of which is equal to the affinities or microforces that occur in the reaction on whether A chooses B or whether A chooses a different reactant such as C or D that ends up at an unfavorable end state. To conclude our deconstruction of question 4, what is the purpose of existence, we're going to take a look at the 1983 words of American physicist Bruce Lindsay, who in his Social Exemplifications of Physical Principles gives us the most erudite, as things stand, synopsis of how the minimum principles of physics are the replacement for purpose as we define things from an atheistic point of view. He says, the teleological idea or concept of purpose is involved in several physical principles, notably Hamilton's principle and related but identical principle of least action, Hertz's principle of the straightest path, Gauss's principle of least constraint, and Fermat's principle of least time. He says, they all effectively state that things take place in the physical world, for example, the motions of systems of particles or the motions of humans in social systems, in such a way as to make a certain function assume a stationary value under given boundary conditions, usually a minimum as compared with all possible values satisfying the given conditions. He goes on to state, Hamilton's principle is not necessary for the deduction of the actual motion of the dynamical systems, i.e., the Newtonian or Lagrangian equations are fully adequate. We have no real logical grounds for insisting that nature imposes a teleological requirement on motions of our experience. In other words, he's saying here the Aristotelian view of teleological purpose is a defunct theory. We can't use that in modern science anymore. He continues, nevertheless, the fact that one can exhibit the principles of mechanics in a teleological guise is persuasive, since it serves to tie physical principles with an idea basic to the interpretation that human beings give to much of their ordinary experience, particularly their relationship with other human beings. Hamilton's principle, for example, says that for a conservative dynamical system, the motion between any two instances of time is such that the time integral of the difference between the kinetic and the potential energies taken between these two instances has a stationary value. To pause, he says, it is as if the system has a certain purpose to satisfy, which we saw loosely stated in Planck's statement about entropy. A rational individual is said to arrange his actions so as to be sure of achieving his fundamental desires, whether it be to accumulate wealth or to gain power over his fellow individuals. In particular, the aim here is always to try to attain the given desired end at a minimum cost in human effort. This strongly suggests a heuristic connection with the Gibbsian minimum principles of physics, which we've just touched on.
I don't know that there is order in all of creation. I don't know what that means. I mean, there isn't really order at all. I mean, look at a tsunami. Look what is a tsunami order in our lives? Are hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters order?
Johnson here again gives the wrong answer. She says that she doesn't believe or see any sort of order to things around her. This is always a explosive question when it's thrown at an atheist, for the reason that most atheists who have beliefs in atomic theory, for example, as outlined by Democritus in his On the Nature of Things, bases their idea that atomic things arise out of blind, random, accidental chance. This got carried through into the work of Charles Darwin, who utilized the idea of chance in the selection of species, and that everything's the result of a roll of dice. And in the 1970s, this got upgraded by Richard Dawkins, who, in books such as The Blind Watchmaker, The Selfish Gene, River Out of Eden, argued that everything is the result of blind, random, accidental forces. So a lot of atheists are confused when you say, how does ordered thing arise out of chance? By accident? Let's take a look, before we dig into this, at what Ray Comfort has to say about the ordered formation of a pop can.
Because we know if the can is made, there must be a maker. If it's designed, there must be a designer. To believe the soda can happened by chance is to move into an intellectual free zone. It's to have an echo when you think. It's to have brain liposuction.
Comfort in that last video clip is using what's called the theistic trump card, in that he knows that nearly all atheists believe that things we see around us, according to the standard model of generally accepted atheistic science, arose from blind, random, accidental, roll of the dice chance. This belief is so prevalent, in fact, that there's only 4 atheists shown here that I'm aware of who've ever gone against the chance view of things. Spinoza says, for example, that no thing in nature is by chance. Something appears to us to be chance is only because of our lack of knowledge. Friedrich Schiller, the intellectual comrade of Goethe, who founded with Schiller human chemistry, says there is no thing as chance. What seems to us as the merest accident springs from the deepest source of destiny. Likewise, Lawrence Henderson, in his Fitness of the Environment, says matter and energy have an original property, assuredly not by chance, which organizes the universe in space and time. Henderson, as we will touch on, bases his view of matter and energy and the formation of ordered structures in the environment based on the thermodynamics of Willard Gibbs, in other words, of Gibbs free energy potentials. Alfred Lotka says that the problems of evolution are in a large measure problems of probabilities, statistical problems. Incidentally, this reflection disposes of the rather foolish objections sometimes raised against the theory of evolution, that it ascribes the course of events in an evolving system to chance, such as Comfort is talking about here. When we describe a phenomenon as being governed by chance, we do not, of course, mean that there are no definite causes or determining factors at work. We merely state in these terms that the causes are complex and we do not know the details. Well, most atheists will adhere to a chance based view of things. These are what are called smart atheist. And the smart atheist view says there is no such thing as chance. Everything is the result of forces, energy, matter, and moving things in space and time.
I mean, what is the definition of order? 24 hours in a day? I don't know what that means. I don't, for all the order we think we see, there's a tremendous amount of chaos and disaster and horror in our lives. That's just not human. That's not a human construct. It's just not so.
To summarize, when Johnson says she doesn't see order in nature, is because she is lacking education in the physical, chemical sciences applied to philosophy. In other words, Henderson, who we touched on, in 1917 wrote his book The Order of Nature, and used the work of Willard Gibbs to conclude no one, not even the vitalist, doubts that the organism, such as the human shown here, is a Gibbsian system. The modern view of this comes from Daniel Schroeder, who says that to form an ordered thing, such as the baby human, out of nothing and place him on the table, the universe need not summon up the entire enthalpy, or H equals U plus PV, some energy equal to TS, shown here, can flow in spontaneously as heat. The universe must provide only the difference, in other words, the free energy, equal to the enthalpy minus the entropy product of the temperature as work. So it's the measure of the free energy which determines what ordered structures we see around us.
Is there? Morality differs from in every civilization, and they change from religion to religion. They change from era to era. They change from culture to culture. Some things that are allowed in certain cultures we would never allow. And so, I mean, I don't know that says that there's a God. I mean, because people believed in a God, they allowed certain horrible things to go on as moral. They treated women and other members of society very poorly, shabbily. We've hurt, we've killed in the name of religious morals. Religions have gone to war with other religions over differing morals. I don't know that the question is to lead us to an understanding of religion or that to prove that there is a God or anything like that. Morals come from human beings. They don't come from imaginary, non-carbon-based life forms, which is basically what a God is. It's not even a life form. And let's just call it what it is. It's a non-carbon-based, invisible being. So that's morals. Morals come from. I prefer the term ethics, because ethics are apart from theology. It's just the way we learn to get together in society, and as we grow as a society and as we progress, our ethics change and hopefully they improve. And my goodness, I wouldn't want to live back in the 50s with those ethics, which were extremely religion-based, and had horrible consequences for people in so many ways.
Johnson gets question number 6, why is there morality in every civilization, pretty much in the general neighborhood of correctness. The quick and short answer is that when a social group is at the Dunbar level, or 150-person group size or less, it can maintain its social cohesion on purely man-to-man contracts, such as outlined on Malcolm Gladwell's famous tipping point. When the group size starts to grow above the 150-person size, to maintain group cohesion, things that are prescribed as wrong or right by that given society have to be written down, and these become legal. And when a group grows to a larger size, say above 10,000, certain powerful actions such as murder, stealing, adultery have to be justified as being wrong or right based on one's conception or saying that these proscriptions are derived through divine inspiration, and that God justifies these wrongs or rights, which is why every civilization has a moral system.
I don't, I've never looked at every civilization to know that that's a fact. Almost every civilization has treated women badly, has treated women as second-class citizens, or has, abused children, had done poor things. Doesn't mean that it's a good thing, doesn't mean that it's inherent in humans, doesn't mean that it's inherent in the universe that there is a creator. It doesn't say that it's a good thing, it doesn't say that it's a bad thing. It might be that every civilization believed in a creator. Another question to ask is, why is it that every civilization has a different creator? I mean, that says that there's something it's culturally based, and there's no uniformity. If there was a creator, why wouldn't we all know the same creator? Okay? We all know the same gravity. We all know the same heat. We all know the same hunger, but we don't all know the same creator? I mean, that's a flaw right there, I would think.
Number 7, why does every civilization believe in a creator? We've already touched on the fact that 90% of all civilizations derive their belief in a creator from Egyptian mythology. The supreme god of this creation changing every 500 years, or cultural recension. For example, there was the Greek recension when Alexander the Great took over the world, wherein the supreme god became a man Zeus. Then there was the Roman recension, wherein the supreme god became God Almighty, and so on, going back to the 1000 BC when Amen was the main supreme god. One point that Johnson notes, which is interesting, is that we all believe in the same gravity, we all believe in the same heat. The problem is that when it comes to power, we don't all believe in the same power. The reason being is that the subject of social physics isn't taught in any modern university, so we have intellectual atrophy about this subject. Only a few people understand that the power or work per unit time that goes into charging a phone or power a phone is exactly the same as the work per unit time that a business person does in their daily activity. But the specifics of this is a subject that's not addressed.
That leads to more questions. I mean, what kind of a conscience? I mean, some people have very little conscience. You might have a conscience, but it's very little conscience. Sociopaths have very little, if any, conscience at all. And they're considered sane. They're considered sane. So, I think that if the question is to say that there's a God because we have a conscience, even with people with consciences do horrible things. I mean, is that supposed to mean that there is a God?
Question number 8, why does every sane person have a conscience? To define things, conscience from the root con, meaning with, and sairi, meaning know, is defined as an inner voice or feeling that is with one's knowledge, acting as a guide, determining whether one's actions are right or wrong. I think what Comfort is trying to dig at with this question is that, from his point of view, atheists have no guide to the rightness or wrongness of one's behavior because supposedly atheists don't have a Bible. Correctly, as touched on in the Zero Theism for Kids video, we now define acts that are right as being exergonic, that is free energy releasing, and acts that are wrong as being endergonic, or free energy absorbing. For example, as we discussed, when a child steals a flower from a flower shop, that absorbs working energy from that system as compared to when a child picks a flower from the wilderness, which is in accordance with nature.